Recording it to the cloud. So I want to welcome all of you to Psychology Day, and good morning to you, Dr. Michael. It's good to see everyone, and or to see that you're here. And we have lots of talks related to the topic of psychology and media over the next today and tomorrow. 6 talks today and 6 talks tomorrow. And if you have had a chance to look at the program, some very interesting talks. I'm very pleased to have our own Dr. Breaux, who is going to get us started on Psychology Day talks. I have sent out a message. I understand that some people have had some problems using the links that were provided, but the actual meeting IDs were correct. So I've sent out a follow-up meeting to the psychology majors and psychology graduate students Moodle pages where it has the meeting IDs, so you can manually put in those meeting IDs or have other people put in the meeting IDs, and they should still be able to get in. So our first speaker today is Dr. Breaux. Dr. Breaux has long and deep connections to UL and our psychology department. I remember when she was one of our star undergraduate students way back, in the day, and her day is a lot more recent than my day. So, by the way, she also received her PhD through her work in the cognitive science department here at UL, and we have been blessed to have her as a colleague for quite a number of years now. She runs the Cognition and Psycholinguistics Lab, otherwise known as the CAP Lab, and lots of interesting things. I just saw a very fascinating poster, yesterday that was presented related to word choices, and so this topic, I think, has a lot of obvious connections for Dr. Breaux. She's going to be presenting a talk titled "Combating Fake News Through Semantic Analysis." And once again, Dr. Breaux, thank you for being here. And I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you. So
I think I just need the ability to share my screen.
That sounds good. Okay, great.
All right, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you for the introduction. This talk was definitely made possible by the hard work of many people, including the members of my Cognition and Psycholinguistics Research Lab, but especially Chloe Leger-Watson, a psychology student who graduated in 2018, and also Taylor Johnson, who many of you know and who has been involved in putting together Psychology Week this year. All right, let's see if I can navigate. So if you know anything about me, you probably know that my research focuses on lexical semantics. This is just a fancy way of saying that I'm interested in word meaning. So when you think of word meaning, you probably think about dictionary definitions. But when I think about word meaning, I think about what information you have in your head, right? So what does that really mean? Well, it means that I am sort of using the things that I learned from my doctorate in cognitive science, like Dr. Perkins mentioned. I'm looking at word meaning through a cognitive lens. And so, if your definition of psychology includes the study of the mind, the brain, and behavior, my research focuses on trying to understand the mind, all the mental stuff and mental processes that we can't see and we can't touch, but seem to be there. All right, so what do you know when you know the meaning of a word? From a cognitive perspective, you know a lot of things. We can use the word cat as an example, which I hope you're familiar with that word. You know that cats are a type of animal. They're mammals. You can form maybe a mental image of the thing I'm referring to. Also, there's an image appearing on your screen in case you don't have that ability. Its general shape, some of its other physical characteristics. We know that it typically has 4 legs. It has a long tail. It tends to be furry, meows constantly until fed. That last one might be due to my own personal experience with cats, though. But that's the thing with the mind. It is personal. Part of the meaning that I tie to this word, even a simple word like cat, includes my previous experiences with cats. I've had mostly positive experiences with cats, but I know other people who have not. I know people who are highly allergic to cats, and that feeds into what comes to their mind when they encounter this word. All these pieces of information that are become active when we encounter words, I consider as part of their meaning. So, as you are aware, this talk isn't about cats. It's actually about fake news. And even though the term fake news was widely popularized during and after the 2016 US presidential election campaign, it's been around since at least the end of the 19th century. And so here is an example of the term being used in 1890 in a Nebraska newspaper. So it reads, fake news. The following is handed to us for publication. Sunday's Enterprise says that I and a companion were run over by the Neptune and thrown into the water. As can be proved by more than one, we did not so much as get our feet wet, nor were we helped into the Neptune. Clarence Collins. So this example seems to provide a clear-cut sort of definition in which we have this compound noun fake news, with the word news used to refer to material published, or in this case, submitted for publication, or otherwise disseminated by a news source. And the word fake used to refer to the idea that the information provided is like false or counterfeit. And maybe that's all it is. Maybe that's the meaning of fake news. And even the current definition provided by the Oxford English Dictionary falls in line with this simple sort of approach, defining fake news as news that conveys or incorporates false, fabricated, deliberately misleading information. However, what's interesting is the Oxford English Dictionary does acknowledge 2 main ways in which we use the term fake news. So the first is to refer to inaccurate stories that are circulated on social media and the internet, especially stories that serve a particular political or ideological purpose. So that seems to correspond with my understanding, right, of what might be happening with fake news. And they also acknowledge a second piece, which is that sometimes this term is used to seek to discredit media reports, especially when they are regarded as or to make you think that they are partisan or untrustworthy in some way. And again, I think I've seen that sort of in my anecdotal experience as something tied to fake news. Now, these acknowledgments suggest that there may be more to the meaning of this term than just the combination of what we think news refers to and what we think fake refers to. And it seems that, factors such as where a person encounters this information and someone's intention when using the word might actually feed into its meaning. I already told you, though, that my interest is not in dictionary definitions. I want to know what meanings everyday people carry around with them. So, how are we going to get at this? Well, one thing we might think about doing is presenting participants with something that we might label with the term fake news. And in fact, researchers working to develop software that they're trying to use to detect fake news have come up with even their own definitions, right? So one example of this is Pothast et al. They define fake news as a certain kind of news spread much more successfully than others, and that these news are typically extremely one-sided, hyperpartisan, inflammatory, emotional, and often riddled with untruths. Well, that seems to add a lot more features and factors than the previous dictionary definitions that we were looking at. This definition takes into account a variety of factors that we didn't consider earlier. So the successful spread or the viral nature of this type of information, the idea that it often offers information through the lens of only like one political perspective, and that it evokes strong emotions from the reader. All right, so like I mentioned earlier, maybe what we need to do is, instead of hashing through all of these different definitions, we need to present participants with something that we might label as fake news and see whether any of these features or factors seem to be relevant in their application of the term. And that's exactly what we did. So in this research, we selected 12 news stories from a collection of news stories that were compiled by Pothast et al., who I mentioned on the previous slide. We made sure that each story contained information relevant to the 2016 United States presidential election, and that each story was not longer than 1 page in length. 6 came from very liberal news sources. So these included or consisted of Addicting Info, Occupy Democrats, and the other 98%. And the other 6 came from very conservative news sources. So those would be Eagle Rising, Freedom Daily, and Right Wing News. From each source, we selected one story that journalists had already verified as containing mostly true information, and also one story from each of our sources that journalists had already verified as containing mostly false information. We gave each participant in our study one of these news stories to read with no information about its source, no information about its author. The only thing participants had was the information contained in the news story. All right, so our participants for this study were undergraduate psychology students enrolled in at least one psychology course here at UL Lafayette. And of course, they were part of the psychology department's SONA system participant pool. In total, we ended up with 299 UL Lafayette students participating. We did gather data at two different time points. One was the fall of 2017, so a year after the 2016 election, and the other data collection period was fall of 2018. We did exclude participants if they were reported being a non-native English speaker. 13 of our participants did not complete the entire study, so we didn't look at their data. And then 48 participants incorrectly responded to our comprehension questions that followed the story to make sure that they were paying attention to the information presented. So we didn't look at their data either if we weren't convinced that they had actually read the story that we gave them. So we had data from 235 students was a part of the analysis. So of primary interest were what we're going to refer to as fake news ratings, in which we basically just asked participants to rate the degree to which the term fake news could be used to describe the story that we gave them. We wanted to see what factors would have an effect on these fake news ratings. And based on a variety of different sources, including some of the definitions that we looked at leading up to this for fake news, we developed a list of factors that we thought might actually do this and have an influence on these ratings. So we're going to start by focusing on our manipulated variables. So these are variables associated with the one news story that each participant was presented with. And they were presented with different types of stories. The ways in which those stories varied were either that the story contained mostly true information or that it contained mostly false information. There was also a manipulation in terms of that source, right? So was it a hyperpartisan liberal source or a conservative source? So where was that article originally published? So that was one of the things that we were interested in, is whether these manipulations, right, would have an influence on the way that people decided whether the story they were reading was fake news. Now, in addition to those manipulated variables, we also just measured a lot of variables. So to start off, one grouping of that measured variables that we were interested in involved what I'm generally referring to as affect. So like the feelings that people might have experienced when reading the news story. And so we had 3 scales that we presented to participants. We followed Bradley and Lang, who have done basically they do a lot of research on words and people's responses to words. And so we used scales that they had previously developed that look at these like sort of extremes in affect. So whether someone feels very unhappy when they're encountering this information, whether they are feeling happy as they're reading this information. And then we have the other scales with calm and excited being anchors on one, and controlled and in control being the third. So thinking about affect and how the feelings that emerge when people are reading these stories, how that might have an influence on the ratings that they're giving for whether what they're reading is fake news. All right, another grouping of interest was related to information about the author. Now, remember, we didn't give the participants any information to go off of, but we did ask them lots of questions about who they thought was writing this news story. And so we asked them questions about the author's intentions. Did they think the author's intent was to, on one side of the scale, mislead the reader, or on the other side, provide useful information? Did they, or something in between, right? Related to the author's status, did they think the author was, I just have two examples up here, but did they think they were likely to be a Facebooker, a blogger, a politician, an independent journalist, a journalist with a news outlet? So we were looking to see whether they had particular thoughts about who this person might be. And also, the political orientation and or affiliation of the author. So whether they thought the author was coming from the far left or the far right, and the political affiliation. So whether the party affiliation would be a Democrat or Republican. So we asked, who do you think was writing this? And participants answered all of those questions. We also asked about truthfulness, right? The extent to which they thought the information that was being provided in the story was, from completely false all the way to completely true, or again, somewhere in the middle. We also wanted to know if the participants agreed with the information in the story. So we had a range from like, I fully disagree with the information that was provided, or I fully agree with the information. We also wanted to know how often participants had encountered a story like the one we provided. So from, never seeing one like it to seeing stories like this all the time. And we also wanted participants to be able to predict the likelihood that they thought the story would go viral, that it would be spread really rapidly. So we have all the way from, 0% not likely at all, no one's going to spread this information, or 100%. It was very likely in the minds of the participants that, this was going to spread wildly and rapidly. All right, another group of questions we asked was about the participant themselves. So we wanted to know about their own political orientation, their own political affiliation, how often they sought out information about the sources of the news that they encounter in their everyday lives, right? So do they go and seek out that information from never to always? We looked at time spent on news. This is sort of, every day, how much time people are spending. And we had ranges from 0 to 15 minutes, all the way to more than 2 hours. We also had a very similar question that we provided participants that asks specifically about the 2016 election and how much time they were spending during that sort of period of time. All right. So we thought that each of those factors that I went through might play a role in the meaning of the term fake news. So what we were looking for is evidence that a factor plays this role, right, and contributes to this meaning. So our assumption was that in this study, the factor would significantly predict fake news ratings. So that's what we're going to look at, is to see how often that happened with the different factors that I just mentioned. Now, before we go into, before we go into that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our participants. So in general, we did have a typical kind of college age population, a mean age of 19. And you can see that this is primarily because 70% of our participants were freshmen, 18% sophomores, and then you see a big drop off when we get to juniors and seniors. Also, as is typical for data gathered through our SONA systems participant pool, is that our participants were primarily female. So we had 82% of our participants select female as their gender. Okay, some other things to note about our participants is when we look at the degree to which these students sought out news source information when they encounter news in their everyday lives. It was interesting to note, sorry, I'm going to move the Zoom information. It's interesting to note that we get this sort of distribution where a lot of our participants are in the not often category, right? Where they're saying that they don't really follow up on where the news that they're encountering is coming from, right? And we have a decent number of participants who are in the never category, right? Saying that they never look at that source information. And then we kind of drop off from there with very few of our participants saying that they always check source information for their news. So thought that was pretty interesting. We can also look at the distribution related to time spent on news. So this would be, engaging with news on a daily basis. And we see that most of our participants are in the shortest time period that was available, right? Not saying that they don't really on a daily basis engage in too much consumption of news. But then we did have a few participants in those higher level categories where even some reporting 2 or more hours each day spending on news. So there definitely was a wide range, but we can see where the majority of participants are in the distribution. Now, remember we had the similar question about during the 2016 election. And the interesting thing, right, if I kind of toggle back and forth, so you can see this was time spent on news. This is asking kind of like about current habits. And then this is asking about previous habits, right, related to presumably the 2016 election cycle. And one of the main differences, I think, you could see like clear differences in how the distributions are spread out. But one of the things that we're seeing is more time being spent across those other time periods that we didn't see as evident in like current practices when there wasn't an active, like a US presidential election happening. So we thought that was interesting as well. We can also look at the distribution for political orientation of our participants. So here we have, we had our participants choose from a variety of different categories, including a category where they could say they were in the center, and also a category in which they could tell us that they didn't know what their political orientation was. This is something that we had added from having already conducted previous research and asking students these questions. In that data, what we realized is that participants were giving us like responses that did not match up when we asked them first about political orientation. They would give us like an unexpected response for political affiliation, in which we asked the party. And one of the things we suspected is that maybe participants, especially when they're freshmen and sophomores in college, might not be familiar enough with where they stand politically to make this choice. And so that's why we gave people the I don't know option. We do have some follow-up data on why they picked I don't know, but I don't look at that in the talk. But if you're interested, we do have that data. So you can kind of see that the middle of each side, so middle left and middle right, tend to have, center and I don't know, right, garnered the most responses. But then if we're looking at left and right in terms of the political spectrum, we see that middle left and middle right were selected more often than their counterparts. So we also thought that was interesting. And you can kind of even see here, right, that we're going to have more people who identify as, we're likely to have more people who identify as Republican than identify as liberal. So if we associate the blue bars with liberalism and associate the red bars with Republican. And we see that here, right? So when we did ask, this is data from a forced choice where we asked participants, like, which side do you lean to most, especially when they didn't choose an option at the forefront. And when they were forced into choosing a side, these were the differences that we saw. So fewer people who identified as a Democrat and more who identified as Republican. Okay, I did see something in the chat. Oh, thanks. I just want to make sure if it was a question, I would be happy to answer. All right, so that was a bit about our participants, right? And who are providing us with even more information than just that. We'll now kind of go into the results. And of course, remember that what we're doing is we're focusing on these fake news ratings, and we're wondering what can predict, right, these fake news ratings. How would I know what someone's going to consider to be fake news? Oh, I think, Val, you pointed out, Dr. McIvers, thank you for that. I don't think I had, yeah, so I must have misspoke maybe, because the two questions that we asked, one we're calling political orientation, and that gets at the left-right distinction. And then the other gets at what I'm referring to as political affiliation, and that is Democrat or Republican. So two different questions. So hopefully that helps. All right, so this is our distribution of fake news ratings. And you can see that, this was a tricky task. We gave people a story with not really any context and asked them to give us ratings about whether they thought this was fake news. And that most people said, yep, it might be, it might not be, which makes sense. But then we do have a pretty large group of people saying that what we gave them probably is fake news. Now, remember, only half of the stories that we're giving people contain mostly false information, right? The other half contain mostly true information. So let's see what is helping us maybe to predict these ratings. Okay. So did the following factors, we're going to break them up just how we did earlier when I introduced them, is, did they have an impact on fake news ratings? In other sections, we're going to talk directly about prediction, but when we're looking at the manipulated variables in particular, right, these had to do with how we picked the stories, right? What we knew about the stories from what Podhest et al. Had already done. So as you may or may not have guessed, based on that distribution that we saw of the rating scores, type of information contained in the article did not have a significant, or the news story did not have a significant influence on participants' fake news ratings. So that didn't seem to matter, whether it contained mostly true information or mostly false information. Did not tell us anything about those fake news ratings. So what about the political affiliation of the source where the news was originally published? Did that have a significant influence on fake news ratings? And no. So that didn't seem to have an effect on how people were deciding whether this was or was not fake news. So none of the manipulated variables seem to matter. Sorry, there you go. Crossed it out. Okay, so that's it for our manipulated variables. Now we can look at all the other things that we measured for and see what might be helping us to determine these fake news ratings. So when we look at affect, we're thinking, remember, about how the story made people feel. The only significant predictor here were those unhappy, happy ratings. And basically the way that it worked is stories that made people feel more unhappy were rated as more likely to be fake news. And feelings such as calm, excited, control, and in control did not predict fake news ratings. When we look at the author's, information about the author and what people were like assuming about the author based on what was written, participants' thoughts about the author's political orientation, their political affiliation did not have a significant impact on the fake news ratings. However, when participants thought the author's intention was to mislead the reader, that was associated with an increased likelihood to rate the story as fake news. Also, the perceived status of the author seemed to be tied to fake news ratings as well. Now, I need to show you a graph to kind of work that out, because we had lots of different categories in which participants could have selected to say, I think my author, right, the author who wrote this was a blogger or a Facebooker or a journalist with a news outlet. And positive numbers here, so I have the 0 line sort of highlighted in bright blue. And anything above the line suggests that participants were giving higher ratings of fake news, and anything below that line means that they were less likely to call this, what they were reading, fake news. So when participants thought that the writer was a blogger, a politician, or a Facebooker, they were more likely to rate what they read as fake news. Okay, some other measured variables that we talked about earlier include exposure. That is seeing stories like this previously. that did not seem to have an effect on those fake news ratings. That virality prediction, like how likely would this information be to spread, like would the news story go viral, that didn't seem to predict fake news ratings. But truthfulness, the degree to which students thought that the story contained false information, was a significant predictor of fake news ratings. So the way it worked is that when participants thought the information in the story was false, they were more likely to consider the story to be fake news, right? Makes sense. An agreement kind of worked in a very similar way. When participants disagreed with the message, they were more likely to consider the story to be fake news. Check. Oh, good question, Dr. McIvers. In the previous graph that we were looking at with author status, I have not looked at like the pairwise comparisons, not yet, but that is a great question. All right, and last but not least, remember we did ask participants about themselves, and turns out nothing that we asked about the participants themselves seemed to be predictive of those fake news ratings. All right, so what do we conclude from all of that? Well, remember what we're trying to get at is maybe what people think the term fake news means. And so based on this data, I'll argue that, you know, it's a news story. That's what we presented them with, but that makes them feel unhappy. That is written by someone whose intention it was to be deceptive. That they believe was written by a politician or a stranger on the internet. That they think contains mostly false information. That contains content they disagree with. So I think this data really brings to light the issue of some inherent biases that we have as humans. What I think fake news is seems based primarily on people's perceptions of the story, right? And not reality. Reality was half our participants received a story with mostly true information. The other half received a story with mostly false information. That manipulation, we didn't find to have an effect on these ratings. So the reality of the story didn't seem to matter, right? The reality of the truthfulness. But it's what the participants believed about the truthfulness that seems to account for a lot of the findings, or how they felt, right, about the story that they read. We also saw, remember, in that students are not often checking the source of their news. And so I think that suggests that if we are going to combat the spread of fake news, we might need to rely on technology like fact checkers to maybe determine, you know, whether a news story is fake news, because apparently we are susceptible to a lot of biases that make us inclined to think something is fake news when maybe in actuality it is not. Oh, I did add, sorry, I think I jumped ahead of myself and didn't show you the slide. So let me, oh, is it showing up? Let me see. Okay, there we go. So you should now be seeing on your end this infographic about how to spot fake news. So when we started our research efforts, these type of infographics were really popular. They were, you know, being shared. So, you know, in an attempt to kind of help people to understand how to avoid, like, you know, falling for fake news or spreading fake news. And these are some of the suggestions that they offered, right? Consider the source, read beyond, check the author, supporting sources, check the date. Is it a joke? Check your biases, ask the experts. So a lot of things that kind of came up in this data, we're seeing that check the author. You know, we might have intuitions about the author, but we're probably not going to like consider the source. And that biases, right, are going to be maybe one of our major issues here. So students in the study, not often checking the source of their news. I think it's unlikely that they're going to take the time and effort to do any other things that are listed, you know, any of these other things that are listed here. And mostly because relying on our beliefs and intuitions is really easy. So if we're going to stop the spread of fake news, like I was mentioning earlier, you know, first we need to be able to identify it. Turns out, doesn't seem that at least, you know, freshmen and sophomores in college are not very good at it. So, you know, we need maybe an easy solution that would help us to do this, something that wouldn't take lots of time and effort. Maybe it would mean using resources like technology and fact checkers, and maybe even those that like integrate into our news media, right? Because I think even going out and using one takes that time and effort that might not happen for everyone. All right, and basically it is in this way that I think researchers could use semantic analysis, like the type that I walked you through in our study, to try and help combat fake news. And that's, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Breaux. Very, very timely and interesting topic. I find personally that my brain is flooded with relevant questions and just associations to the topic as well. I want to give an opportunity for any of our audience to ask any questions. I may have a question or two, but I can always like catch you if we don't have time, you know. So so I want to like open the floor to either through chat or to unmute yourself. That questions would be welcome at this time.
I know I answered a few as I went.
I have I'll go ahead and ask a question. Any of these findings especially surprising to you? Given like any of the like your expectations entering into the study, or were you pretty much you just didn't know what you were going to find, and you know, and you found, you know, some interesting stuff?
Yeah, I think the way that we went into it was we really just kind of combed through what was out there in terms of definitions at the time for fake news. And we just picked out all the things we thought might be relevant elements. So it really was very exploratory in nature. But I think what maybe, I guess, surprised me the most is just at least in these very simple relationships that we were looking at, right? So does this factor predict something about ratings related to fake news? That the information about the person themselves, right, did not seem to have an influence. It was much more, you know, so it wasn't necessarily anything about their own identity, right, that was causing them to have a response. It was more of what was your response to the news story? Like, did you agree with it? Did it make you unhappy? So it's like those experiences seem to have a larger effect than what we might think of as like personality characteristics or things that I might hold close to my identity didn't seem to actually matter in this context.
Dr. McGivers has a question or comment.
Actually, a question. That was a really interesting talk. And my question has a lot to do with the sample. I perceive 18-year-olds to be relatively uninformed about most things because they haven't really explored the world. What do you think would change if you did a sort of snowball sampling method where you asked university students to solicit participation from other family members who perhaps their parents, for extra credit kind of a thing? Would you get getting a sample of more mature participants? Do you think your results would change in important ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I know, a clear answer off the bat. I mean, I think I know some of the things that would probably change would be that people would maybe have a political identity, which it seems that our sample, showing that students who are early on in their college careers, for the most part, don't have that established, right? They're choosing like, I don't know, or they're like, I'm in the center, maybe, right? And like I was mentioning, we do have some data following up on like why people say, I don't know. And a lot of it is exactly what you're talking about. Like, I haven't had the chance to develop that on my own. I've grown up, in this particular household, but I don't know that that's what I believe. So some really interesting things there. So I think we would find less of that, right? And more established, maybe political identities. And so maybe then political identity does become, right, a factor that plays a role in some of the things that we're seeing. I still think we're likely to find that the way that people feel about the stories is going to be the thing that really guides whether they're rating it as fake news or not.
Just to follow up a little, I wanted to mention that the research on political affiliation and the development of political beliefs actually indicates that you're not likely to see clear ideas until they're at least 21 or 22. So it's the early 20s where that really emerges. And that 18-year-old sample is just not going to have what you need to do this sort of research. So just saying, thank you very much.
Yes, no, and I appreciate the idea of, doing some snowball sampling to get, wider, especially age range in our participants.
I wanted to, I have like a couple thoughts that come up for me too, but I also wanted to point out that those of you who are in the audience or who maybe are looking at this recording at some point down the road, that if you find this topic to be intriguing and fascinating, I would also recommend that you check out Dr. Michael's talk tomorrow, Truthiness Revisited, which is going to be at 10 o'clock tomorrow. I'm going to be checking out the recording for that talk. I'm actually having to teach at that time, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing that talk, as well. I think that these topics sort of, from what I've seen from previous presentations, kind of dovetail very nicely with each other. I had a question in terms of the stories that you used, Dr. Breaux. You mentioned that there were stories that were mostly false and stories that were mostly true. Did you make sure that you had, like, when those stories were used for the study, was it care was taken to have very clear sort of boundaries between between the real stories and the not real stories, because I actually think that there are degrees of misrepresentation in the media, right? You know, like for example, there are lots of stories by people that, like you said, are not intending to be deceptive, but are making some clear statistical error that only somebody maybe who's done, you know, who's practiced at looking at stuff will catch. And then there's also things that are mostly, you know, based on fact, but pitched, you know, with language, you know, from a particular angle that could be, you know, misleading or one way or another. So was there like a clear sort of standard of that were for what is characterized as mostly true and false?
Yeah, so we were using what Pothest et al. Had done previously. They did the categorization. They used journalists to identify, you know, different categories of articles from all the sources that I talked about. They also had sources that were like central. So, but those only contain, those stories, turns out, were all mostly true, right? So like the sources that were not super partisan, like hyper partisan, contain mostly true information. And so we didn't have that contrast there, right? And so we stuck to like focusing on the endpoints, where there were actually 3 categories that Pothest et al. Found. So they had ones where the journalists were saying, you know, identifying that of the information within that article, most of it is true. Or in the article, you know, most of the information included was false. There's also a 3rd category that we did not include to try and make that clearer boundary, which was like, it kind of contained both, you know, so there were mixed ones, but we did not pull from that set. And we did a kind of, you know, I talked about the structure, like the different options, and that, you know, from each of the sources, we'd have one that was in this category, one that was in the other category. And when we were choosing them, though, we tried to do it like randomly, like as randomly as we could, given that we had a lot of criteria they had to meet. And so like if we picked one and it didn't meet the criteria, we picked the next one and then went on until we had stories that met all those criteria.
Thank you. I have, you know, I actually have like lots of other questions, but we are already pushing our time limits. We don't have a 10 o'clock talk today. I probably would have wrapped it up even a few minutes earlier, but thank you so much for sharing. And I think it's very intriguing, very thought-provoking. Dr. MacGyver's asked me to say where the recordings will be available. At the end of the day, I will attempt to create a, based upon my previous document with the Psychology Day talks and an attempt at accurate links on those talks, which apparently not all the links have been equally working for everybody. So, but I will replace the link for an upcoming talk with a link for the recording. And then what I ask you all to do is to keep me informed. I'm going to be checking it as to whether it works on my end, but apparently when things work on my end doesn't always mean that it works on other people's ends. So if you all would be able to give me some feedback as to whether those recording links are doing. For Tuesday's recordings, I will be planning to send something late tonight, which will be sort of a recapitulation of Psychology Day schedule for tomorrow, and also a listing of today's talks with the Zoom link to the recording. And hopefully everything is going to work out just fine. Thank you so much for getting us off to a great start, Dr. Breaux. I always enjoy your talks about these things. Really, really interesting stuff, and lots of stuff to think about. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Remember, every talk has a different recording. So either use the link if it works or type into Zoom ID if you need to. And we hope to be see you guys at some of these other talks. Thank you so much. See you later.
Thank you.